convicted in a deadly double stabbing in Coral Springs, executed at a Florida state prison tonight. Local 10's Bridget Matter joins us live in the newsroom with what we know about the state's 7th execution this year.
In the year 2000, Richard Knight stabbed his cousin's girlfriend, Odessia Steffens, to death and murdered her 4-year-old daughter, Hanicia Mullings. This happened in Coral Springs. Knight later confessed to another inmate while housed at the Broward County Jail. That inmate testified against him. He was sentenced to death after being convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder in 2006. And just hours ago, he was executed by lethal injection, making him the 7th person executed this year by the state of Florida.
After spending nearly 3 decades on Florida's death row, Richard Andrew Knight Jr. was finally led into the execution chamber. His crime was so brutal that it left an entire community horrified. A young mother, a 4-year-old child, and an unborn baby. 3 lives lost in a single night of unimaginable violence. Today, on the Execution Files, we're examining the shocking case of Richard Knight Jr., the murders that sent him to death row, the evidence that convicted him, the appeals that failed to save him, and the final words he spoke just moments before his execution. But before we begin, make sure you subscribe to the Execution Files and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. If you're fascinated by true crime, death row cases, and real-life criminal investigations, you're in the right place. Now let's open today's file. Richard Andrew Knight Jr. was born in Jamaica. In 1998, he arrived in the United States seeking opportunities and a fresh start. However, his life in America quickly took a different path. According to court records, Knight remained in the country illegally after arriving and soon became involved in criminal activity. Authorities later linked him to robberies, drug-related offenses, and violent behavior. Even before the murders that would make headlines across Florida, Knight was already facing serious accusations. Those allegations included the sexual assault of a teenage girl and the physical assault of a child. Although these accusations had not yet resulted in the death penalty case that would define his life, they painted a troubling picture of a man whose behavior was becoming increasingly dangerous. By the year 2000, Knight's situation had deteriorated even further. He was unemployed, he had little money, and he had nowhere stable to live. That was when he turned to family, a decision that would ultimately end in tragedy. Knight contacted his cousin Hans Mullins. Hans lived in Coral Springs, Florida, with his girlfriend, Odessia Steffens. The couple was raising their 4-year-old daughter, Hanicia Mullings. At the time, Odessia was also 6 weeks pregnant. Wanting to help a family member in need, Hans allowed Knight to stay in their apartment. But not everyone was comfortable with the arrangement. Odessia reportedly disliked the idea from the beginning. She viewed Knight as irresponsible. He wasn't contributing financially, he wasn't working, and tensions inside the home were becoming impossible to ignore. Arguments became increasingly common. As the days passed, the atmosphere inside the apartment grew more hostile. No one could have imagined how violently things would end. On June 27, 2000, Hans Mullins left for work. Before the evening ended, he spoke with Odessia on the phone. She told him she was preparing for bed. Knight was still inside the apartment. At some point that night, Odessia made a decision. She wanted Knight to leave. According to prosecutors, she confronted him and told him it was time to move out. What followed would become one of the most horrifying crimes in Broward County history. An argument erupted. The disagreement quickly escalated. Then, without warning, Richard Knight armed himself with a knife. What happened next was an explosion of violence. Knight attacked Odessia. The assault was sudden and brutal. But there was someone else inside the apartment. Someone who witnessed the attack. Someone only 4 years old. Little Hanicia Mullins. Despite being only 4 years old, Hanicia reacted instinctively. Seeing her mother being attacked, she tried to help. She attempted to protect Odessia. She attempted to stop the violence. She never had a chance. According to prosecutors, Knight turned his attention toward the child and stabbed her repeatedly. The little girl died from her injuries. Meanwhile, Odessia fought desperately for survival. Investigators later determined that she attempted to defend herself in the kitchen. Evidence suggested she tried to grab another knife. A violent struggle followed, but Knight ultimately overpowered her. The attack continued until she was mortally wounded. Because Odessia was pregnant, the crime claimed not just 2 lives, it claimed 3. A mother, a daughter, and an unborn child. Chapter 5. The Neighbor Who Heard Everything. While the attack was unfolding, a neighbor upstairs began hearing disturbing sounds. Loud banging, crashing noises, screams, the terrified cries of a woman, and the desperate screams of a small child. Realizing something was terribly wrong, the neighbor called 911. That phone call would become one of the most important pieces of the investigation. At approximately 12:21 a.m., officers were dispatched to the apartment complex. Within minutes, police arrived. What they discovered would shock even experienced investigators. Officer Vincent Sachs arrived at the apartment building and immediately noticed something unusual. He could still hear screaming. Lights were visible inside. After repeatedly knocking on the door and receiving no response, he began checking the surrounding area. Then, something changed. The lights inside suddenly went dark. A nearby window that had previously been only slightly open was now wide open. The curtains hung outward. It appeared someone had just escaped. Using his flashlight, the officer looked inside. What he saw immediately raised alarm. Blood. A significant amount of blood. Moments later, officers entered the apartment. Inside, they discovered one of the most devastating scenes imaginable. Little Hennessy Mullins was found near a closet. Odessia Stevens was discovered elsewhere in the apartment. Both victims had suffered multiple stab wounds. The nightmare was over, but the hunt for the killer had only just begun. Police didn't have to search long. Less than an hour after the murders, another officer spotted Richard Knight hiding near bushes roughly 100 meters from the apartment. His appearance immediately raised suspicion. There were fresh scratches on his chest, cuts on his hands, blood stains on his clothing. When questioned, Knight claimed he had been jogging. Investigators weren't convinced. His explanation made little sense. The evidence told a different story. Knight was arrested. Inside the apartment, investigators recovered multiple blood-covered knives, the weapons used during the attack. Forensic testing revealed additional evidence linking Knight directly to the murders. Investigators also discovered skin, tissue beneath Odessia's fingernails, evidence showing she had fought desperately to defend herself. The case against Knight was growing stronger by the hour. Although charges were formally filed in 2001, the case moved slowly through the legal system. The trial did not begin until 2006. When prosecutors finally presented their case, the evidence was overwhelming. Physical evidence, forensic evidence, witness testimony, the 911 call, the injuries, the blood evidence, everything pointed to one conclusion: Richard Knight was responsible. The jury ultimately agreed. After hearing the evidence, they returned guilty verdicts. In March 2007, Richard Andrew Knight Jr. was sentenced to death. His new home would be Florida's death row. Like many death row inmates, Knight spent years challenging his conviction. Appeal after appeal was filed. He maintained his innocence. His attorneys raised numerous legal arguments. Courts reviewed the case repeatedly, but the outcome never changed. Judges consistently upheld the conviction. The evidence remained overwhelming. As years turned into decades, Knight remained on death row. Eventually, nearly 20 years had passed since his sentencing. Then came the final decision. The state of Florida scheduled his execution for May 21st, 2026. The end was approaching. Reports indicate that Knight spent his final day quietly. He woke up early. He showered. He remained alone. No family members visited. No friends arrived. When prison officials offered him a final meal, he refused. He also declined regular prison food. Even the offer of a spiritual advisor was rejected. As evening approached, preparations began. At approximately 5:30 p.m., Knight was escorted to the execution chamber. Witnesses took their seats. Officials completed final procedures. Then the curtain opened. Knight was already secured to the gurney. The intravenous lines were in place. Everything was ready. At exactly 6 p.m., the execution process began. Before the drugs were administered, the warden asked a final question. Did he have any last words? Knight responded with a brief statement. I want to give thanks to Yahweh, the Most High. Those would be his final public words. Moments later, the lethal injection process began. Witnesses reported that Knight closed his eyes and remained largely motionless. After approximately 10 minutes, a physician entered the chamber. Richard Andrew Knight, Jr. was pronounced dead at 6:13 p.m. He was 47 years old. The murders of Odessia Stevens, Hennessy Mullins, and Odessia's unborn child remain among the most heartbreaking crimes in Florida's history. A family opened their home to someone they trusted. That trust ended in tragedy. For some, Richard Knight's execution represented justice finally being carried out. For others, it reopened difficult debates surrounding capital punishment. Regardless of where you stand, one fact remains undeniable. 3 innocent lives were lost forever, and their families continue to live with that loss. What do you think about this case? Do you believe justice was served? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this documentary, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the Execution Files, and turn on notifications for more true crime and death row stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next case file.